Hello, my name is Alex Payton, and I am from Bennett Middle School, 8th grade, and this is my History Day project, Oyster Wars of Crisfield. Behind me is the Tangier Sound, where you can see a barge boat coming from the bay. To my right is the Little Anamessex River. To my left is the Old House Cove, and in front of me is Crisfield. And also, you can see in front of us is a chimney from an old fishing plant. And to tell us more about the subject, I brought in my father, Joe Payton, who has studied and is currently writing a book about the history of the Chesapeake Bay and Crisfield. What are the origins of the Oyster Wars in the Chesapeake Bay?
Well, the first account that we have of oysters being harvested is in around 1808, when New England oyster boats first arrived in the Chesapeake. They come from Connecticut, where they had previously harvested oysters up in the Long Island Sound, and they had depleted all the oyster supplies up there. So then they came to the Chesapeake because of our extensive oyster population. But what happened was they came in and they brought these things. They were called drags, which on the Chesapeake we actually call them dredges, but they're spelled dredge, D-R-E-D-G-E. And what happened was that the locals didn't like these New Englanders coming in and taking their oysters. So in 1820, the first law was passed, but in 1830, Maryland passed a law where you had to be a resident of the state, and you also and they also outlawed oyster dredging.
Did the New Englanders have any effect on the Oyster Wars?
Yes, they had a lot. See, what happened was they came, and right here on this island, Captain Michael Summers had a little mercantile store, but he also had a navigation school, and he kept a log book from right here on this island of what he saw. So now, if you can see, he had the bird's eye view of the Tangier Sound. Now, at this time, unbeknownst to all the locals, was that Tangier was sitting on the richest oyster bed in the world. All right. Some of the early explorers said that the oyster reefs actually rose out of the water. All right. And they had to have what was called pilots to actually bring them in and out, because the oyster reefs would actually sink their boat. Matter of fact, one of your ancestors, they kidnapped him during the Revolutionary War, so that way he could pilot them up the bay. He refused, he refused. They threw him down into the hold of the ship, and it broke his thigh. And this becomes Sacred. He moved up to Crisfield and become Sacretown. But anyway, so what we get over the period of time is the locals, everybody was poor in this area, extremely poor. And what you get is the locals still trading with these New Englanders. Okay, what they would do is they would park their big schooners right out here in the Tangier Sound. Okay, and then the locals who would be coming from Crisfield, which was then called Summers Cove, it was actually called Anamessex, is the name that was actually used. But what you get is you still get these guys, you still get these guys dredging, these local guys dredging. Okay, and now this evolved into, there's these boats called pungy boats, and they use these schooners. They were 70, 80 foot long schooners, and they would use these to dredge oysters. Now, so the first aspect of the Oyster Wars is the waterman versus the law. Okay, in 1851 we have one of the first noted trials. One of the first noted trials where an officer, his name was Captain John Cullen. He was from Down Neck, which was Anamessex, Summers Cove, which would later become Crisfield. He actually arrested a boat called the Fashion. Now you can see where that barge is, right on the other side of that Smith Island. Okay, on the south side of Smith Island is where this boat Fashion was from. So this guy actually he chased he saw the Fashion, the schooner called Fashion out here dredging in the Sound. He thought they were in Maryland waters, so he, so he arrested the boat, and but this became a big conflict. Now, even though it isn't a war per se, as far as shooting and guns and stuff like that, but this was actually the origins of the Oyster Wars. Now, later on in the 1860s, right here behind us is called Old House Cove. Okay, in the 1860s we have his name was Captain Alex Corbin. All right, he was actually out here in the Sound, same deal. Okay, now back then what happened is as soon as they caught you dredging, they took your boat and they seized your boat, and the boat was pretty much everything. It was your way to get around, it was your way to make a living. If they took your boat, you were done. So what they did is this guy, is this boat, is this police officer saw Alex Corbin scraping, or saw him dredging, arrested him, tied him up. He was towing him into port up here to where Summers Cove was. Well, this Alex Corbin said, heck with this. He got his mate to cut the line, okay? And then what happened is that this Alex Corbin came, he sailed right up here in Old House Cove, right? And he started firing at this police boat. All right, now this police boat, he started returning fire. Alex Corbin ran out of ammunition, so then he got his mate to start bringing them all of the lead weights for the fishing weights. And he started loading his gun up for the fishing weights, okay? And the story goes is that he riddled this, he riddled the police boat's cabin. He filled it full of holes. The police boat backed off. Later that night, he come out of Old House Cove and he escaped, and he went over to Virginia, and he stayed there for a long time.
What is another aspect of the Oyster Wars?
All right, well, besides the locals against the police, you also had Maryland oystermen versus Virginia oystermen. Now, the boundary line, which was originally, it goes across Smith Island, but originally went down by Fox Island. The Virginians claimed that it passed right here on this land we're standing. So there was always confusion about the boundary line. So all the time you would have Virginia people oystering up here, you'd have Maryland people oystering down Virginia. Now, this boundary line was so important. Now, remember what I told you about if they would confiscate your boat if you got caught oyster dredging. This was so important to the Smith Islanders that all the Smith Islanders took their children down to the boundary line. Okay, there was a rock down there, and they took their children down there, and they actually spanked them where the rock was, so they would never forget where the boundary line was. Seems a little crazy, but this has really happened. And as a matter of fact, there's testimony where the Smith Islanders say that they was beat on this rock, so that way they would never forget. But that's another aspect, is the Virginians would come up, the Marylands would go down, and then also another aspect are the oyster pirates. The oyster pirates are the New Englanders. Say in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, everybody started thinking like, hey, we better get this before they're gone. So it was a mad rush, okay? This is when you start seeing the original oyster boats were called pungy boats. The next one were called bug eyes. Then around the 1890s, you had a boat that was called the skipjack. This is what everybody knows today is the historic oyster boat. However, this is the third boat that we had. Now, what you would have is you would have these skipjacks coming out, and they would actually have guys with rifles shooting each other. And in the 1870s, there was this guy's name was Lieutenant Winslow. He was part of the Oyster Fisheries Commission. He wanted to come down, he wanted to survey just how many oysters. When he told this person up in Annapolis that he was coming down to the Tangier Sound, he said, be careful. He said, life is cheap down there. Another book I read said that it was very common to see bodies just floating in the bay. I mean, just see bodies floating in the Sound. Okay, they said they would just be floating right along as they sailed. Now, This also came from the oyster pirates. So you've got all these boats. Now Crisfield, when the railroad came, this became the mecca for the oyster industry. Everybody was coming here because the train was immediately taking it up to, it was taken up to New York, Connecticut, and Boston, and all the northern markets. Everybody, there was thousands and hundreds of boats, okay? In 1880, Crisfield had 1,400 sailing vessels registered just to that little town. So what happens is you have all these captains, you need a crew, all right? So what happens is, a boy like yourself, if you're, there was actually agencies in Baltimore that for the sole purpose of getting crews for these work boats, these bug eyes and skipjacks and stuff like that. So what they did is when they couldn't fill their quota, they would take a guy out, they would either take him to a saloon, get him real drunked up, right? He'd pass out, they'd put him on the boat, and he'd wake up out here next morning right here in this water behind where we're standing. Another aspect is that if you were walking alone, they'd come up, hit you behind the head, knock you out. Now, German immigrants, Baltimore had a lot of German immigrants. These oyster pirates loved these guys. The reason is because they couldn't speak English and they couldn't turn them in. So what happens is when these guys, if they thought they were too much of a threat, instead of paying these guys, they would actually pay them with what was called getting paid by the boom. What they do is they'd call them up, they would have them do something near the side of the deck, they would have their boom, they'd spin the wheel, that way the boom come across, they'd call this guy's name, he'd look up, the boom would smack him, he'd go over and okay. He had boots on, he had the leather coveralls on, okay, and that was it for him. All right, last question is, how did the oyster wars stop? Are they, okay. Are you still filming or is he going to edit it? Okay.
How did the oyster wars end?
Well, the oyster wars are actually, they faded out, obviously, as the oyster population declined, okay? And then in the 1980s, right across the Potomac River, okay, on the other side of the bay, there were oyster wars still in the 1950s, up in that part, okay? They were fighting for control of the Potomac. These guys would go out at night, right? And there were actually some of these oyster police would hide, wait for them, okay? And there were guns, shootout guns, just like there was over here. But the oyster wars has kind of evolved, and it's still going on, but now it's going on between the watermen and the interests of the aquaculture industry, right? And if you talk to people that are on the side of the aquaculture, they want to do it, they're trying to push the watermen out to help save the bay so that way they don't take the oysters, okay? But actually, even some of the federal scientists from NOAA just come out with a report in November of 2018 saying that the watermen weren't the cause of the diminished oyster population. It was because of ecological factors. Now, but what's happened is both of these sides, the aquaculture and the watermen, both want control of the bay. So even though it's not as deadly, it's still an oyster war.